Good afternoon and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management Webinar Series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen and I'm the Program Manager for the Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. We would like to extend a special thanks to Bob Ellis of the Mobius Network for providing the webinar management software for this series, and Lisa Ruggiero and Laura Flagg of the National Recycling Coalition for assisting the RMC with webinar promotion and technical support. Today's webinar focus is on gypsum wallboard recycling. Our presenter today is Terry Weaver, who I'll introduce in a moment. Following the presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you are experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Terry Weaver is president of USA Gypsum and has a 35-year background in agriculture and construction. Mr. Weaver served as president of an international agricultural construction firm, as well as owning and operating farms in Pennsylvania. For the past 17 years, Mr. Weaver has focused on expanding wallboard recycling and developed beneficial uses for reclaimed gypsum. He is currently serving as director for the Construction Demolition Recycling Association, also known as CDRA, a national organization which promotes the environmentally sound recycling of construction materials. In 2002, Mr. Weaver and USA Gypsum were named National Outstanding Green Small Business by the National SCORE Foundation. And right now I'm going to turn the program over to Terry.
Thank you, Wayne, and I'd like to extend a special thank you to all of you who took the time out of a busy schedule to learn a little bit more about wallboard recycling. As Wayne mentioned during the introduction, for the last 17 years, that's been my primary occupation. And during that time, we learned a lot about that you shouldn't do and few things that you might want to think about duplicating. Gypsum wallboard recycling has been evolving, but sometimes it's helpful to go back and just look at history and where gypsum came from. In particular, we're going to talk more about the fireproofing aspects, but it was used as a mortar named plaster of Paris, and that goes back to the Egyptian pyramids, and there's some proof possibly even farther. But after the Great Fire in London in 1666, the King of France decided that he didn't want a repeat of that in any of his cities, and so he ordered that all wooden buildings be plastered with gypsum in the hopes of preventing a similar fire, and that was successful. Sometime later, gypsum then was used to finish the inside of structures using lath, horsehair, and plaster, and I haven't been able to find reliable dates on when that came about. But in late 1800, sacket board was developed, and that was used similar to the drywall, as we call it, or sheetrock gypsum wallboard that we're using today, except that it had felt backing. About 1910 in the United States, gypsum wallboard, pretty much as we know it today, was developed and has gained in popularity ever since that time. I'd like to talk about one of the key aspects of gypsum, and that is that gypsum powder is the only natural substance that can be restored to its original rock-like state by simply adding water alone, nothing else, and then form back into shape and harden. And this can be repeated endlessly. It doesn't lose any of its characteristics no matter how many times we've changed its status. And then just incidentally, we probably all use gypsum at some time today. At least if you use toothpaste today, you probably did. And I imagine it's 5 o'clock somewhere, so somebody may have had some beer, and good chance that they used some gypsum in it, along with vitamins and tofu. So it has many applications. Gypsum wallboard recycling or gypsum that's reclaimed from wallboard, we have not attempted to have FDA certified for use in food and don't plan to. So how long have people been trying to recycle gypsum wallboard? Well, it's been about exactly 30 years. The granddaddy in this business is New West Gypsum. Started in Canada in 1985. I think they're still the leader, at least by volume, anywhere in the world. They have, I believe, 7 plants now, with several in Canada and a handful in Europe, as well as one in the United States in Washington State. Somewhere around 1996 and through 2000, there were quite a few startups, people trying to divert the wallboard from the landfills. There were a variety of end markets attempted, and I know of at least probably 24 specifically that started up during that time. About that same time, or just a little bit later, people in Europe started looking at keeping gypsum out of their landfills, and plasterboard, as they call gypsum wallboard in Europe, recycling began. Pictured in the picture is the little plant we started out with. Had a little hand feed machine, and we're doing a couple thousand tons a year. But while we didn't become overwhelmingly successful there, we did prove a theory, and that is that we could take gypsum wallboard and reclaim it in a way that was desirable to be used in place of mined gypsum. As time progressed, during a time period 2000 to 2010, most of the U.S. startups failed for a variety of reasons, and I think that's not unusual. Startups in almost any type of business have a high failure percentage, and this was no exception. I think the one common denominator among the survivors was almost all of them in the United States developed agricultural markets, because they just couldn't make the economics work going back into new wallboard or some other markets that they attempted. But during the same time period, there was extensive growth in Canada and the EU. I believe that this was driven, number one, by policy and regulation, which sought to keep it out of landfills in a very aggressive manner. This led to higher disposal fees, and so those recyclers could make an economical model work, taking wallboard scraps, reclaiming the gypsum, and supplying that back to wallboard manufacturers in place of mined or synthetic gypsum. So during that time, we grew from 2,000 tons up to 25,000 tons a year in volume, and you can see our location in the picture. So why did the EU have this growth? To look at that in a little more detail, in 2002, a lot of landfill regulations came in whereby gypsum wallboard could not be introduced into landfills that were accepting MSW or other waste, and had to be put into a separate landfill. That spread throughout Europe, and by 2013, they have now issued a protocol that addresses nearly all aspects of wallboard recycling, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there are at least 14 companies operating in Europe now, and at least 24 plants. Most of them, or almost all of them, are closed loop, meaning that the gypsum that they're reclaiming from the wallboard is going back to the manufacturers in place of mined or synthetic gypsum. Their results from country to country, even though it is considered the EU or European Union, do vary. I believe the highest countries are reclaiming about 40%, and that varies down to 0 for some of the less developed countries or countries where there are alternative, less expensive disposal avenues available, such as backfilling old coal mines or other options that they may have as opposed to going to a high-end landfill. So why is it important to recycle gypsum? I know that many of you that are tuned into this webinar are familiar with issues of managing landfills, but for those of you who are or possibly aren't, just a reminder or a recap. We've probably all heard about landfills that had serious H2S or hydrogen sulfide odors, some of them to the point where they were actually closed as a result. Hydrogen sulfide in the recovered gases or methane is a contaminant that at certain levels has to be removed before it can be used as in place of natural gas. The sulfate that dissolves out of the wallboard after it's been in landfill for some time also contaminates the leachate, and in some cases has to be treated differently. And then finally, if it's incinerated, of course, wallboard was created to be difficult to burn, but if it's burned in an incinerator, it tends to release sulfur dioxide gas. So why do all these things happen? Basically because gypsum, when it's placed in an anaerobic state, in the presence of organic matter and moisture, will start to change the form of sulfur from a sulfate to a sulfide as a gas. And there are probably those of you who are listening that know much more about this than I do. But this problem is not new or uncommon. You can find plenty of research on it for well over 20 years. So what part does gypsum play in having clean air and clean water? Well, the Clean Air Act requires SO2 reductions, and so as a result of that, many of the coal-fired power plants installed scrubbers in their stacks to remove the sulfur that was being generated from burning coal for power. And they did that by injecting liquid lime. The combination is a synthetic gypsum, which is chemically identical to mined gypsum. This new source of gypsum completely flooded the markets from 2005 to 2012, to the point where in some areas gypsum was considered almost more of a waste than it was a product, and the prices actually dropped to 0. So that was tough for somebody trying to make it in the recycling gypsum business. Then in addition, in the mid-2000s, the EPA started to take a look at all of these coal combustion residuals and the regulations regarding them, and they included things such as slag and fly ash and gypsum, or some people call it FGD if it's generated from a power plant. I think it was included almost just because it was part of the CCRs. But some people were pushing for that, for the CCRs to be categorized as a haz waste, when a great deal was being used for beneficial use as an additive to ready-mix concrete, cement, and other uses. And so while this played out from about 2008 to 2014, it kind of put a cold freeze on anybody investing any money in changing things about the way gypsum was handled. And we ran up against that in several cases where people said, well, we're going to consider wallboard recycling, but not until this issue is resolved. As a result of these regulations and reviews and many other regulations that you've been hearing about, we probably all have heard that there's less coal being burned, and of particular interest to wallboard recyclers, that equals less synthetic gypsum on the market, less total gypsum. And another thing that might be considered an unintended consequence is that for many years farmers had all the sulfur in their soil they needed, which came in the form of acid rains, and when the air became cleaner, we started to have soil sulfur deficiencies, and so this clean air meant that farmers needed to purchase more sulfur. About the same time, many of these air regulations were being changed or reviewed. Clean water was also getting a push, and something that is termed sometimes a pollution diet was handed out to certain areas, especially those of us who might be in the Chesapeake Bay watershed have heard about, which would be your TMDLs, or the total maximum daily loads of various things that can enter the water stream. It's perhaps coincidental that gypsum, one of gypsum's most important characteristics is that it helps to control erosion and sediment runoff, and interestingly also prevents phosphorus on the soil from dissolving and entering the surface waters, which is a major cause for algae growth. If any of you have been paying attention to the water quality news, you've probably heard a great deal about some of these topics as they are in regard to the Chesapeake Bay, the Great Lakes, and the Gulf of Mexico dead zones. So then we have some economic factors that have, I believe, had an important impact on wallboard recycling. In 2000, the U.S. Green Building Council released the LEED point system, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And as part of that, it granted points in their score for recycling. That system has changed recently, and we'll talk more about that later. But the one thing they missed during that time was having a good auditing system, and so it was kind of done on the honor system, and those results, as you can imagine, were spotty, as there was some people doing some creative accounting. But it did bring about an increased level of interest in recycling construction waste. That was just getting going well when, as we are probably all aware, the recession hit. And if you look at that chart to the right, it just gives you a quick, good graphic of total construction spending, and you see that ramp up until 2008, and then that deep valley. And of course, during that time, wallboard production and cement volume dropped, and the demand for gypsum products dropped along with it. And of course, the landfills had to compete. They have budgets too, so they needed to attract tons, and some of them lowered prices, and that made it more attractive to send construction debris to a landfill versus to a recycler. During the same time period, there were a few landfill bans, one statewide in the state of Massachusetts. Then there were a patchwork of things from zoning ordinances to other state legislative initiatives that encourage recycling of construction materials, notably in the West Coast and New England. And so they also increased the level of interest And once again, though, the enforcement of those initiatives was sometimes subject to interpretation. So now the question in my mind is wallboard recycling poised for growth? I think we have some positive indicators. The CCR issue being resolved through the EPA in a way that allows continued beneficial use, I think is positive. I believe that we will continue to see a decline in synthetic or FGD gypsum being produced as less coal is being burnt. New mines are really not feasible. That would be new mine for mined gypsum rocks. Of course, we're seeing some increased demand because of the construction recovery, agricultural demand for some of the things we just covered in the previous slide. And once again, landfill capacity is back on the radar as tonnage flowing again, and budgets may turn from attracting tons to maximizing revenue on tons instead. I think our actions probably speak for themselves. In the picture is our new facility, which has a capacity for 100,000 tons annually that we moved into in the spring of this year. So more about growing markets. Once again, I believe we're going to see increased demand for a period of time and reduced supply. And we may gradually shift from considering FGD gypsum excesses as a waste to be dealt with to actual resource management as that supply of gypsum dwindles and new mine sources are either more expensive or impossible. So the real market, and the largest market by far, is new wallboard. And the picture on the left is fairly small, and I apologize for that, but want to thank USG for allowing me to use it. That's one of their newer plants. And across the country, there are 62 wallboard plants, and they're producing 19 million tons of board products per year. The picture to the right is a modern-day cement mill. There are 98 plants in the United States. They produce 77 million tons of cement, and they consume 1.5 million tons of gypsum. So those are two of the large bulk markets that can have an outsized impact on wallboard recycling. Another reason I'm optimistic is that the agricultural markets now are well proven and they're growing. Just to re-emphasize, gypsum is calcium and sulfate, so it is a fertilizer and a soil amendment that almost every farmer needs in some form. You could buy it as gypsum or as some other form. And I think possibly even more important is the ability of gypsum to reduce phosphorus runoff. I think this is going to become a hot subject in the very near future. We've also developed a nice market in the animal bedding business. It's a soft, dry material for keeping animals comfortable, and that market is growing for us. The annual market for agricultural and other miscellaneous uses is 725,000 tons per year. And the annual market tons that I've just referred to in the last two slides are derived from the U.S. Geological Survey reports. So, how much construction and demolition waste is there out there? A recent report, in fact, I believe it was featured on another webinar for this group, showed that there were 476 million tons annually. That's based on a 2013 number, so I believe it's probably up slightly since that time. And of that, a large amount is concrete masonry or blacktop, and they make up most of the tons, and they're recycled at high rates, mostly on site, and reincorporated back into new road base or other such things. However, there are 100 million tons of what I believe is easily recycled wood, metal, cardboard, shingles, and drywall primarily. There are some other minor waste items there, but they make up the majority, and all of them can be recycled, and most of them, except for shingles and drywall, have well-established end markets. According to the CDR white paper by the University of Florida that was presented here within, I believe, the last year, 35 million of those 100 tons were recycled. So now we drill down to the topic that interests me, and that is how much U.S. wallboard waste. And here we find numbers all over the board. An EPA report from 2013 showed 13 million tons. The CDR white paper estimated 6 million tons. And I estimate 4 million tons. So you can choose who might have the more reliable numbers, but I think there's an explanation for the difference. It's often difficult to get good numbers, and so the methodology could be the topic of a whole different presentation. But some large differences may well be pre-consumer, that is the waste from manufacturers, demolition, and then again the methodology. My 4 million is based on 20% of the new construction board that is manufactured and shipped being wasted. So far in the United States, demolition has not received much interest on either the markets or from the recyclers, and so we're just not considering it at this point. So why is 20% wasted? For those of you who are familiar with construction, you may really know this, but it essentially comes down to the fact that gypsum wallboard is a fairly cheap commodity, and putting it in place involves a lot of labor, and the most expensive parts of installing gypsum wallboard is the finishing of the joints, the painting, and that sort of thing. So anytime there's a joint that has to be finished, there's a lot of costs in that, and anytime there's a joint problem, it involves a callback. So if there is a window, a doorway, or any other kind of cut like that, typically they put the board and then cut out that window or door, and the piece that they've cut out is not saved for reuse. It's tossed. I think the 20% number is conservative. On jobs where we've done sort of separation and monitored, we've found rates that range from 15 all the way up to 40%. So I feel comfortable that my 20% number is probably on the conservative side. So then we drill down farther and we say how much wallboard is actually recycled in the United States. The CDR white paper, again, reported 300,000 tons, which that would be 7% of shipments. And the recyclers that I'm familiar with, who are established and I'm going to say formal, are probably 10 across the country. And so it's being done at a very, very low level. So why only 7% for a product that everybody knows how to recycle and it's been done for 30 years? I think the number one thing is that the mentality in the construction industry has been just to throw everything in one container and send it somewhere, whether that could be to a single stream or to a landfill. Is generally not considered much by the crews that are at work handling these wastes on construction sites. We do know that if the wallboard is commingled with the other wastes and exposed to weather, we're going to have a reduced recovery rate, even if it does go to a single stream facility, and the quality of that recovered material will have deteriorated. So there's some single stream loss. And then we go to, urban volume versus logistics. And for those of you who are familiar with what I call curbside or recycling in Pennsylvania under Act 101, they're all the same issues: urban volume versus logistics. And then you have easy logistics in rural areas, but you don't have much volume and you have to travel long distances, and costs and all those kinds of things have an impact on that. But the picture on the right, we have a situation we'd love to duplicate more. We had a little space on this project, and we had a willing contractor that they kept its source separated, so the material that arrived at our plant was clean, uncontaminated, and makes great recycling material. So let's talk a little bit more about single stream recycling. I wish I had a better picture than the one I'm showing you, but hopefully you can see that a single stream facility involves lots of trash and lots of equipment. And that equipment is moved through specially designed equipment to handle C&D. These people that have invested millions of dollars in these facilities are doing a great job of recovering a significant amount of construction waste that otherwise would have found its way to the landfill. But wallboard provides them with a real challenge. If I zero in on that picture, where you see the red arrows, you'll see a guy down there in a safety vest, and the other arrow, you're going to see a pile of wallboard. The companies that have single stream that are separating wallboard successfully actually check the loads coming in. When it has a high percentage of wallboard, they dump it off to the side, then do a negative sort, meaning they pull the contamination out of it and then put it into a bunk to ship to someone like ourselves. And we have to handle this manually as opposed to through the system. I'll try to shed some more light on that, but typically when those trucks arrive and the mixed construction wastes are dumped out on the floor, they'll use wheel loaders to push it on a pile. Grapple attached to some kind of machine is used to pick it up, put it onto a conveyor. In some recycling systems, there's even a pre-grind to reduce the size to where it's easier to pick. And then almost every system crosses a screen next to leave the dirt and fines fall through. If the wallboard is left in the mix, a great deal of the wallboard by this time is destroyed down to powder size and ends up being in those fines. In most systems, the fines that are screened out go to landfills as alternative daily cover, or ADC as we call it. And a typical well-run single stream construction waste handling system will produce from 20 to 30% of the volume that enters that system will go out as fines. The topic of a great deal of debate in the last couple of years has been whether or not shipping fines out as ADC is recycling or disposal, and that we'll touch on again in a future slide. So by the time that wallboard goes through all that mechanical handling and gets up to the typical sort line where the folks you see here are pulling off a variety of recyclables from that belt, there's typically almost no identifiable pieces or recoverable pieces of drywall that can be picked off and sent out for recycling. So now we have a new version of LEED from the United States Green Building Council. LEED version 4, for those of you who are in tune with that, is coming into play. We still have some of the older versions where projects were filed under the old version working its way through the system, but all new applications have to go under version 4. And it encourages a great deal more transparency than the earlier versions, and maybe inadvertently also encourages source separation. Under version 4, you need to identify whether it's source separated or whether it's going as commingled to a recycling center, and also need to identify the end markets for those products. So it presents a farther challenge to something that's near and dear to my heart, which is something in the industry we've termed sham recycling. And we have situations where people would bring everything in, run it through a grinder, cherry pick a few of the valuable items, and send 50 or more % out by rail as alternative daily cover, and claim that they had recycling rates sometimes as high as 95%, with no auditing and no identification of markets. It just happened on a fairly wide scale. So now under version 4, the ADC can no longer be counted as recycling, and as I touched on before, even a legitimate best effort at reducing ADC probably is somewhere around 20 to 30% fines that need to be dealt with, and can no longer be counted as recycling no matter what their end would be. So LEED version 4 provides 1 point for a 50% recycling rate, 2 points for 75% recycling rates, or if you can document that you generated less than 2.5 pounds of waste per square foot of building, which is very difficult to obtain. I believe it's very difficult in most types of construction to hit a 75% rate without ADC counting and not recycling wallboard. There's another point that is available now that might be less well known, and that is if a single stream facility has been approved and audited by a certified independent third party, there is another point available. So in theory, if you hit a 75% level and you went to an approved single stream facility, there could be 3 LEED points now available for recycled content. So we talk about source separation and logistics versus space. Here's just a couple good pictures. We have a nice rural spot here on the left, room to set a dedicated container, and on the right we were loading drywall on pallets that have been brought down an elevator, and we have the forklift out on a crowded, busy street. So those are some of the extremes. In urban spaces, generally not enough room for multiple dumpsters, in many cases in the cities. C&D waste can be commingled and inserted into what are often called minis, the little red containers in the upper right, and then rolled down to a street or parking area, and a crusher packer truck up. There's gypsum in that mixed waste. By the time the packer truck's done, it's really turned to powder that can't be in any way separated from the other waste. Then we deal with things like staging space. If we're going to have a separate dumpster, and we can only have one there at a time, we've got to be able to stage a whole dumpster load of drywall or wallboard before we bring the wallboard dumpster. So it's got to be stacked somewhere. Gentleman on the left is dealing with one of those piles, and a cart on an elevator goes taking it down a freight elevator and somehow getting it in that container. So now to talk about a potential solution, New York City generates 300,000 tons per year, and that number comes from the building product ecosystems. For years, we've been working on attempting to get wallboard out of New York City. We've had some success. Have a few good partners there, worked with us for a long time. There have been some policy efforts going back to 2003 that involved everything from zoning to some city efforts. There have also been some auditing of the recycling rates. And after all this trial and error, I suppose you could say, we actually tried the One World Trade Center, and we got some loads out, but it was just very difficult, and everybody kind of lost interest in it. And I'd like to give a shout out to the Durst organization, because they decided that they wanted to make this happen going forward. They have a group that's building product ecosystems, which looks at a lot of different facets of building, but within that, they formed the Wallboard Systems Work Group, which is a partnership between academia and industry and other stakeholders. And here are the primary stakeholders that started out, and we've been pleased to be a part of all this. I don't know how many of you can read this this little spot graph, and I apologize if you can't read it, but it just gives you an idea of all the different people that have been involved in this project, from building owners to government to academia and manufacturers and architects and construction management, and they put together a large group of people that have an interest in what happens with wallboard and how we can get it out of that system and get it recycled. So after some time of collaboration, a pilot project was launched, and it's underway as we speak. It involves 7 million square foot of new wallboard that's being purchased and installed. The estimate is that that'll be 3 million pounds of waste, or 1,500 tons, generated through that, and the estimate would be about 273 roll-off containers worth of waste will be extracted from these projects. Here again, the Durst Group has been instrumental in organizing this and bringing all the players to the table and getting them on board. There's a list of the projects there below, some very nice and notable projects going on in New York City. So there were some very creative solutions to the source separation that happened through this project so far, coming up with different types of carts that could hold the wallboard, be staged, and maybe even folded to be out of the way when use, covering containers when they're parked there so that nobody accidentally dumped other trash on top. And this gives an idea of maybe a typical job site situation, everything going in and out of one dock and elevator for a huge facility. This one is Lend-Lease construction, And the dumpster in the background actually is being loaded with drywall in this picture. Will need to be pulled as soon as it's done and then replaced with a dumpster for other types of waste. So that type of management and juggling around between concrete trucks and other trucks delivering materials does require some extra effort. After the containers are loaded, they're being taken to a company called Cardella Waste, who's been in business in New York City for, I believe, 65 years in recycling. They've partnered with us for, I believe, the last 10 or more. And they have a single stream recycling processing facility. But in this case, those dumpsters filled with wallboard are really source separated and clean. So they set aside an area where they can stage those dumpsters until they have enough for a tractor trailer load. We pick it up in a tractor trailer, bring it to our facility for processing. And if you can, that's our facility on the left, and then on the right, we had a nice tour where the whole group made a loop around the sea to follow the material as it made its way through the system. The reclaimed gypsum that came from our plant went to the United States Gypsum Company, a plant that was in a prior slide. And the reclaimed gypsum that we provided was blended with our other sources. And so far that has worked well in process. There have been no quality issues with the board or otherwise. And so actually this closed the loop. So the wallboard made a complete loop. One component of this group was research. Over 50 samples have been taken and tested so far, and they include various pieces of new board from different types, different manufacturers. The group also benchmarked this against demolition board that they pulled. Median metals levels did not exceed established limits so far. And what we're hoping to come up with is a protocol, and I would hold out as an example the EU's protocol PAS 109, which addresses the chemical and physical specifications for reclaimed wallboard, and also best management practices for collection and processing. So I'm not going to talk more about the results of the laboratory work that's been done. There will actually be a presentation by the group at the Greenbelt Expo in Washington, D.C. in November, and so I'm sure if you happen to be there, you'd want to catch that, and if not, it'll be online afterwards, so those results will be posted. So, to conclude the closed loop project, I'm going to read a statement that I took from actually a USG report, and that statement I hope is not true. I lost it in my note field. So I'm going to try to summarize it from memory because I lost it somehow. Maybe I found it again. Yeah. I apologize. I don't think I can get it to move. I got it. Until costs and legislation associated with the disposal of scrap gypsum in landfills becomes more restrictive, recycling will likely continue to remain a low priority within the industry. And I'm hoping to prove that in one way that statement is wrong, and another way that it's right. And in one way, I think we do need to see some movement in policy as an encouragement. But another way, I am thinking that the transition of gypsum as a resource, as opposed to being viewed as a waste, is underway. We know that change is hard, and we have a lot of people involved in this loop to successfully get wallboard from job sites back to the manufacturers. But if you remember the numbers that we talked about before, and the 19 million tons of wallboard products that are being produced, and the 4 million tons of gypsum waste that's available, they are the only ones that can take a significant volume. That 4 million tons dwarfs the current agricultural and cement tonnage combined, which would be about 2.25 million tons. So we could get the 50% recycling rate if we replaced all our gypsum sources for agriculture and cement as we know it today, and that would be difficult. So in order for wallboard to become, wallboard recycling to become a standard operating procedure, we definitely need buy-in from the manufacturers. So I think a bigger question is price and volume. When will the price of gypsum come up enough to make it interesting for the wallboard manufacturers to buy reclaimed wallboard gypsum? And when will I have enough volume as a recycler to approach a manufacturer and make it interesting to him? Just as an example, most new wallboard plants consume about 500,000 tons per year. So when I go talk to one of their buyers and I tell them I have 1,000 tons a year, I'm probably more trouble than I'm worth at any price. So, and since I'm an old farm boy, I talk about the chicken or the egg. So I'm not sure which is coming first, volume or maybe neither one. But I'm optimistic at this point that we can close this loop and that it makes good sense environmentally and eventually will economically as well. So thank you all for your attention, and I believe we're going to now open for questions.
Yes, thank you, Terry, for that great presentation. Again, if you have a question, please enter them on the GoToWebinar dialog box, and we already do have a few questions. So I'm going to start off with this one concerning the wallboard from China. Is anyone tracking the origin of gypsum board for recycling to ensure that a contaminated wallboard from China does not get into the recycling stream?
I don't think that any wallboard is currently being imported from Canada and hasn't since their unfortunate incident going back to about 2006 or 7. And since we don't deal with demolition board, for one thing, we're not too concerned about it because there's no new board coming in. We don't deal with demolition. And then just incidentally, from the geographic area that we're located in, almost all that board, unfortunately for the people in the South, went to Florida and into the New Orleans area.
Is there any problem associated with recycling Type X drywall?
We're not aware of any problems with Type X. There are other specialty types of wallboard that present market challenges, and in fact, we are not permitted to recycle a few of them.
This question concerns recycling wallboard that's collected at MRF. What are the costs involved in collecting recycling material in a MRF setting?
I'm not sure exactly what the question is, if it's the cost of separating it to MRF or the cost associated with transporting it to a recycler. So I'll try to I guess answer it in two parts. There are single stream construction waste processors, and then there are transfer stations, and their cost to handle or separate the wallboard varies substantially depending on the workforce and the space that they have available. So I'm not sure I can answer that one. In terms of what we charge to accept wallboard, those numbers would range anywhere from $15 a ton for the highest volume, best quality, on the low side, and on up to about $40 a ton for a pickup truckload that rolls in.
Can wallboard be recycled when nails and or paint are in or on it?
Nails and other incidental foreign material are really not a problem. We have magnets and other methods of dealing with minor contamination. We don't accept demolition or painted wallboard because of the unknowns and what we'd be dealing with the paint on the surfaces.
This question has to do with, have you ever seen or tried a trunk screen to sift out the crushed and powdered gypsum while it gets crushed in a compactor truck? So I guess a new way of handling the material.
I believe if the packer truck had wallboard only in it and other wastes weren't mixed, if the wallboard came out of a packer truck, we would not have a problem handling it in that form if it wasn't cross-contaminated. If it was commingled and put in the packer truck, and then you went across a screen to take out the gypsum, I'm afraid there'd be too many other cross-contaminants with the gypsum to have a quality product.
In your particular process, do you remove the paper from the wallboard, or do you grind it with the gypsum?
We remove the paper.
And where does that material go?
Paper is used for animal bedding, and it's a good quality fiber. So if you make it clean enough, there's plenty of paper markets there.
Are there any issues concerning asbestos, lead-based paint, or other contaminants?
Well, there are issues, of course, with asbestos and lead-based paints and other things, and those are the reasons we don't accept demolition wallboard. There are just too many unknowns for us to feel secure, even though, in theory, lead abatement and asbestos abatement is all covered under other regulations on a job site and should never find its way to us. We just are not interested, and neither are customers interested in taking the end material that may have been derived from demolition board.
You touched on this previously a little bit. The blue and green board. You have problems with those types of wallboard? I saw a picture of the blue board.
There are actually different types of blue. So the blue board's interesting. What you saw in the picture is called shaft wall. So that's a standard core with a different color. But if you're talking about fireproof board and moisture-proof board, they're not suitable for agriculture. May be suitable for certain industrial applications in the reclaimed material. But the total amount of, I'm going to lump them all together and call them specialty board versus regular board, is about 11% according to the manufacturer's shipments. So it's not a significant portion of the volume, but it is a nuisance, like contaminant in any other type of recycling, whether that be paper or plastic.
Okay, I think we're out of questions, so I think we're gonna wrap it up now. Again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and the Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Terry, for making the presentation. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar, and please visit the NRC and the RMC websites for schedule updates. And have a great day, everybody.